The illusion of perfection. Charles Bont had built his life around one thing: control. Every aspect of his existence, from his towering Wall Street empire to his personal relationships, was carefully curated, meticulously crafted to project the image of power, success, and perfection. In his sharp, tailored suits and cold, calculating demeanor, Charles embodied everything the world admired and envied. The streets of New York recognized him instantly, and the elite circles of finance revered him. Yet beneath his polished exterior, beneath the designer suits and the facade of unshakable confidence, there was a man constantly at war with himself. It had all started many years ago, in a small, run-down neighborhood far from the glittering lights of Manhattan. Born into poverty, Charles had never known the comfort of wealth. His mother, a hard-working woman who toiled day and night as a waitress, had done her best to care for him. But Charles's father, a distant, unloving figure, was long gone, leaving his mother to raise him on her own. That childhood had instilled in him a hunger, a fierce, relentless hunger to escape. He had never wanted to be that boy again, the boy who stood in line at food pantries and watched the rich drive by in their shiny cars. Charles vowed he would never again feel the sting of inadequacy. And so he worked, and worked. Every hour, every minute, every ounce of energy was dedicated to climbing the corporate ladder, building wealth, gaining status. He knew that success was his only weapon against the world's disdain. It wasn't long before Charles became a titan in the world of finance. He had it all: a penthouse with views of the skyline, a private yacht docked in the harbor, and an exclusive circle of friends who flaunted their wealth like trophies. Yet despite his apparent success, Charles's life was marred by something he had never been able to escape: the fear of vulnerability. He had learned early on to suppress any sign of weakness, to build walls around his heart, to avoid anything that could threaten his fragile control. But then, Eleanor Vanderlyn had appeared. Eleanor was everything Charles thought he needed: a beautiful socialite, poised, graceful, and from a family as old and established as the Vanderlyns themselves. Their courtship had been swift, a perfect match of wealth and influence. She saw in Charles a man who could elevate her social standing, who could provide her with the life of luxury and comfort she had always dreamed of. For Charles, Eleanor was the final piece of the puzzle. She was a symbol of success, a woman who embodied everything he had worked so hard for. With her, he would be complete, secure in his position at the top. Their engagement was the talk of New York, a high-profile affair that captured the attention of the city's elite. Invitations to their wedding were coveted like golden tickets, and the ceremony, set in the opulent St. Patrick's Cathedral, was destined to be a spectacle of wealth and grandeur. But as the date of the wedding approached, Charles could not shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach, a feeling he had tried to ignore for years. He was terrified. Not terrified of marrying Eleanor. That was a formality, a business transaction, really, but terrified of what it meant. To love someone meant to open himself up to the possibility of loss, and Charles was a man who could not afford to lose. The thought of surrendering any part of himself, of allowing anyone to see the real Charles Bont, flawed, vulnerable, was more than he could bear. Yet he pressed on, determined to follow through with the wedding, to cement his place in a world where power and wealth were the only currencies that mattered. As the day of the wedding dawned, New York was bathed in brilliant sunlight. The city, so often clouded by the shadows of its towering skyscrapers, seemed to shine in celebration. St. Patrick's Cathedral stood at the heart of it all, its stone walls adorned with flowers and ribbons, its pews filled with the city's most influential and wealthy residents. The air buzzed with anticipation as guests in their finest attire mingled, admiring the opulence that surrounded them. Charles stood at the altar, his hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain composed. His sharp gaze swept across the room, scanning the sea of faces, but his eyes were drawn to Eleanor as she entered, radiant in her shimmering white gown, her face the picture of grace and beauty. The room held its breath as she walked down the aisle, her father by her side, and for a moment, everything felt right. This was what Charles had worked for. This was his moment of triumph. But then her voice cracked, and the mood shifted. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. Maria continued, her voice now thick with emotion. I reached out to you, Charles. I tried to get you to understand. But you weren't there. You walked away. You abandoned me. The sorrow in her voice was unmistakable, and yet there was no bitterness, only the quiet resignation of a woman who had been left behind. Charles's heart lurched, his pulse quickening. He had not expected this. He had not expected Maria's pain to be laid bare for the world to hear. In his mind, he had always justified his actions. He had told himself that he wasn't ready for fatherhood, that his career was everything, that his ambitions were too important to allow anything, especially a child, to get in the way. But now, as her voice echoed through the cathedral, he realized the depths of his selfishness, the harm he had caused. The tape crackled as Maria's voice became more urgent. I had to raise Daniel on my own, she said. And I did it. I loved him with everything I had. But it was hard, Charles. It was so hard. I didn't have anyone to help me. And now, I'm afraid. Her voice softened, the words tinged with sadness. Daniel deserves more. He deserves a father. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. For years, he had convinced himself that he had no part in Daniel's life. He had convinced himself that he had done the right thing by staying away, that he had no obligation to the child of a fleeting affair. But now, listening to Maria's voice, Charles understood the enormity of his mistake. He had abandoned a son, his son, and in doing so, he had abandoned a piece of his own humanity. As the tape continued, Maria's voice grew quieter, her words filled with a sense of finality. I don't know if you'll ever hear this, Charles. But if you do, please, don't let Daniel grow up without you. Don't let him suffer the way I did. Be the father I always hoped you could be. The tape clicked off, and the silence that followed was deafening. The guests in the cathedral had fallen completely still, each person processing the enormity of what had just been revealed. Charles stood at the altar, his heart racing, his body rigid with shock and shame. He looked at Daniel, the boy who had been standing so bravely before him, clutching the tape like it was a lifeline. Eleanor, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, stood frozen in place. The veil she had so carefully placed over her face earlier that day, both literal and metaphorical, was gone, torn away by the raw truth that now hung heavy in the air. She stared at Charles, her gaze full of betrayal, her lips trembling with barely contained anger. The world that had once seemed perfect had crumbled before her eyes. And then, in a movement that felt both slow and immediate, Eleanor ripped off her veil and threw it to the floor at Charles's feet. Her voice trembled as she spat the words that would tear their relationship apart. You liar. You deceitful, heartless liar. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned and fled the cathedral, her sobs echoing through the cavernous space. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flickering between Charles and the boy who had shattered the illusion of perfection. The pristine image of a fairy tale wedding had disintegrated in an instant, leaving nothing but raw, exposed truth. Charles stood there, feeling the weight of the world crashing down on him. His mind was reeling, his body trembling. The mask he had spent his entire life perfecting, the mask of a man who had it all, was gone. In its place stood a man broken, vulnerable, and exposed. All the years of wealth, power, and success suddenly felt like empty, hollow victories. And yet, amid the chaos, Charles couldn't help but look at Daniel, the boy who had come to him with nothing but hope, who had fought to be heard in a world that had ignored him. In that moment, as Daniel's small, fearful face met his gaze, something shifted within Charles. The weight of redemption. The world around Charles had collapsed into chaos. He stood there, unable to move, as the cathedral, once a place of sacred reverence, now a stage for an unexpected unraveling, echoed with the whispers of those who had witnessed the devastation. His mind was foggy, as if the harsh light of reality had been too much to bear. The weight of his past hung over him, heavier than any financial burden or corporate deal he had ever encountered. His carefully constructed empire, built brick by brick, was now crumbling into dust before his very eyes. Daniel stood before him, small, fragile, and yet full of something Charles had long forgotten: hope. The boy's eyes, wide with uncertainty and fear, were the only thing Charles could focus on. He felt the pull of something deeper than the surface-level shame and regret that had filled him moments before. It was a feeling he couldn't quite explain, but he knew it well, a recognition of what was truly important in life, and it was standing right in front of him. But even as his heart stirred with this unfamiliar feeling, the reality of the moment still pressed down on him like a vice. Eleanor had left. Fled, in fact, tearing their relationship apart with the force of her fury and betrayal. The guests who had been present to witness a grand union of wealth and prestige now stared at him as though he were a stranger. The sharp glances, the hushed voices, the shaking heads. It was clear that the man who had been once admired by so many was now a subject of scorn and ridicule. Charles took a tentative step forward, his gaze never leaving Daniel. The boy seemed so small in the vast cathedral, as if swallowed by the grandness of it all. But it wasn't the grandeur of the cathedral that mattered now. It was the small, trembling boy who had stepped forward, uninvited, to reveal the truth that Charles had tried so desperately to hide. "Daniel," Charles whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The words came out like a confession, like an apology that had been years in the making. His knees felt weak as he moved towards the boy. He knelt before him, trying to match his son's height, to meet him eye to eye in the only way that seemed right. His heart clenched painfully in his chest as he saw the tear-streaked face of the child he had abandoned, a child who had been lost to him for so many years. "I'm so sorry," Charles said, his voice raw. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I wasn't there for you. I should have been. I should have been a father to you. I didn't know how." Daniel stood frozen, his eyes locked on Charles, a mixture of confusion, hurt, and an almost imperceptible flicker of hope dancing in the depths of his gaze. For a moment, Charles wondered if he had heard him, if the words had even reached him. But then, slowly, Daniel's small hand reached out, a tentative gesture that sent a shock of warmth through Charles's chest. The touch was hesitant, but it was real. It was the first touch of connection, the first sign of forgiveness that Charles had received in years. It was a lifeline, a bridge between the man he had been and the man he could become. And in that moment, Charles realized that everything he had built, the mansion, the wealth, the reputation, meant nothing if he didn't have the one thing that mattered most: his son. Charles gently grasped Daniel's small hand, his fingers trembling. It felt foreign, yet it felt right. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to feel the weight of vulnerability. The armor he had spent so many years crafting, the shield he had used to protect himself from the world, began to crumble. He no longer needed to be invulnerable. He no longer needed to be the cold, calculating businessman who had sacrificed everything for the illusion of success. The guests, who had once looked upon him with awe, now watched with mixed expressions, some with pity, others with a sense of disdain. They were a crowd accustomed to the spectacle of wealth and power, and they had come to expect nothing less than perfection. But as they watched Charles kneel before the child he had forsaken, something changed. The whispers of judgment began to fade, replaced by murmurs of sympathy. Some were uncertain of what to make of the scene before them, but they couldn't ignore the authenticity of the moment. There was no pretense in Charles' apology, no calculated performance for their benefit. It was raw and real, and for the first time, he wasn't hiding behind a facade. For Daniel, there was a quiet peace in the simple act of connection. The boy's face, still streaked with tears, began to soften as he looked at Charles, a tentative trust forming in the space between them. He had come here today to demand that his father see him, acknowledge him, and in some strange way, Charles had done that. He had acknowledged his past mistakes, and he had promised to change. "Will you give me a chance?" Charles asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "A chance to be the father you deserve." Daniel hesitated for a moment, his wide eyes searching Charles's face, as if trying to discern whether the man before him was genuine. The boy had every reason to doubt, every reason to be angry. But in the depth of his gaze, Charles saw something, a flicker of hope, fragile yet real. And that was enough. But even as the priest spoke the familiar words, even as the vows were exchanged, something inside Charles shifted. His carefully constructed life, the walls he had built around his heart, began to tremble. As he stood there, looking into Eleanor's eyes, a deep, unsettling sense of doubt crept into his mind. Did he love her, truly love her, or had he simply wanted to possess her, to add her to his collection of trophies, to prove to the world, and to himself, that he had conquered it all? The moment stretched on, but just as the priest's voice rang out, asking him to confirm his vows, a sudden disturbance erupted from the back of the church. A young boy, no older than 10, pushed through the crowd, his face streaked with tears, his small body trembling. He shouted, his voice raw with desperation, "Stop the wedding!" The guests gasped, their whispers rippling through the cathedral, their gaze shifting from the boy to Charles, who stood frozen at the altar. He stared in disbelief, his mind racing as he recognized the child. It was Daniel, his son, the son he had never acknowledged, the son he had kept hidden, the product of a long-forgotten affair during his college years. The boy's appearance at this moment was nothing short of catastrophic, but it was nothing compared to the implications of what was about to happen. The unveiling. The silence that followed Daniel's outburst was suffocating. For a brief, surreal moment, the grandeur of St. Patrick's Cathedral seemed to fade away. The delicate hum of whispers and gasps from the crowd grew into a deafening chorus, each voice slicing through the tension like a knife. Charles stood at the altar, frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of the sudden intrusion. The boy Daniel, barely taller than the pulpit, stood at the entrance of the aisle, clutching a cassette tape in his small, trembling hands. His face, streaked with tears, was a mask of both fear and determination. He was a ghost from Charles's past, a ghost Charles had long tried to bury. And now, here he was, standing in the heart of what was supposed to be the most significant moment of Charles's life, the wedding that would seal his place in a world of power and perfection. "Please," Daniel's voice quivered, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency in his plea. "You have to listen to this tape. It's important. It's about my mom. About you." Charles's mind reeled. His carefully crafted world had just cracked open, and he was left standing on the edge, his past crashing into his present. The people in the cathedral began to murmur, unsure of what to make of this interruption. The priest, whose solemn presence had been a pillar of reverence moments earlier, now looked to Charles for guidance, his eyes filled with concern and uncertainty. Charles's heart raced. There was no way out. His secrets, the ones he had so painstakingly buried, were about to be exposed for all to see. He took a slow, deliberate breath, steeling himself, and nodded almost imperceptibly. His voice was barely a whisper as he said, "Play the tape." There was a moment of stillness before Daniel, his hands trembling, inserted the cassette into a small portable player that seemed far too simple for the grandiose setting. The mechanical whir of the tape as it began to turn was the only sound that filled the silence. Then the voice began, soft at first, then growing stronger with every word. Maria, the woman who had once been his lover, the woman whose existence Charles had long ago erased from his memory. He hadn't seen her in years, not since the moment he had made the decision to walk away from her, from their brief and fleeting affair during his college days. He had never intended for things to get so complicated. He had never intended for the affair to lead to anything real. But in that moment, as Maria's voice filled the cathedral, Charles's breath caught in his throat. He had forgotten the depth of her voice, the way it could sound like both a lullaby and a warning. Her words were not harsh, but there was a rawness to them that left no room for denial. "Charles," her voice began, "if you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer around. It means I'm gone, and I have a favor to ask." Her tone wavered between sorrow and resolve, as if she had known all along that this moment would come, even if she could never have predicted the setting. The room fell silent as Maria's words continued to spill from the speakers, painting a picture of a past Charles had long since tried to forget. She spoke of their time together, the fleeting romance that had blossomed between them during their college years, how they had been two young souls, caught up in ambition and desire, unaware of the consequences. She spoke of his charm, his unrelenting drive, the way he had promised her a future they would build together. Daniel nodded slowly, his small hand tightening around Charles. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a dramatic embrace, but in that small movement, something shifted. The boy had given him a chance to redeem himself. It was the gift Charles had never expected, and it was the one thing that would change the course of his life forever. The guests, still in a state of stunned silence, began to slowly disperse. The whispers continued, but now they were quieter, more subdued. Some left quickly, eager to escape the uncomfortable tension of the moment. Others lingered, unsure of what to do or say, watching as father and son stood together at the altar of a ruined wedding. Eleanor's absence was palpable, her departure a gaping wound that Charles couldn't ignore. He knew their relationship was irreparably broken, that the trust they had built would never be restored. In a way, Eleanor had been a mirror to his own life, reflecting the success he had so desperately sought, but also exposing the emptiness that came with it. She had been part of his world, but now that world seemed so far away, like a distant dream fading into oblivion. But as the cathedral slowly emptied, Charles's focus remained on Daniel. The boy who had stepped forward when no one else had, the boy who had fought for his right to be seen, had given him a chance to be something better, something more human. With Daniel by his side, Charles walked slowly down the aisle, his mind still swirling with the aftermath of the day's events. The grand wedding that had once seemed like the culmination of his life's work was nothing but a faded memory. But as he stepped out into the light of the day with his son at his side, he realized that this moment, this connection, this opportunity for redemption, was everything. And so, as the world around him continued to turn, Charles Bont, the once untouchable tycoon of Wall Street, began the long journey of rebuilding his life, one honest step at a time. The heart of change. The city of New York buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, but for Charles, everything felt different. The chaos and turmoil that had unraveled in the cathedral still lingered in his mind like an echo, a constant reminder of the life he had lived and the life he was now trying to create. His world had shifted, and as much as he tried to embrace the idea of change, the weight of his past refused to let him go. Charles had never been one for uncertainty. Throughout his life, he had prided himself on knowing exactly where he was headed, on controlling every aspect of his existence. His success on Wall Street had come from years of meticulous planning, unshakable resolve, and a refusal to let anything, or anyone, get in his way. But now, standing at the precipice of an unknown future, Charles had to confront the fact that the life he had built had been built on a foundation of lies. The perfection he had so carefully cultivated had been nothing but a facade, a mask to hide the parts of himself that he feared. As he walked through the quiet streets of New York, Daniel by his side, Charles's thoughts began to settle. The boy, his son, had already started to change him. It was in the small moments, the quiet conversations, the laughter they shared when Charles took Daniel to the park for the first time, the simple joy of teaching him how to ride a bike, that Charles began to understand what truly mattered in life. It wasn't wealth or power, it wasn't the validation of high society, And it certainly wasn't the endless cycle of business deals and boardroom victories. It was the connections he had denied for so long, the bonds he had spent his life avoiding. It was fatherhood. Every day, as he spent more time with Daniel, Charles could feel the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. At first, the change had been small, a fleeting moment of vulnerability when Daniel asked him to read a bedtime story. The pang of emotion he felt when Daniel looked at him with eyes full of trust. But now, the transformation felt more profound. It was as if the more time he spent with Daniel, the more he realized just how much he had lost by shutting people out. The child had become a mirror to his own soul, a reflection of everything he had been too afraid to confront. The boy had been a part of his life for years, though he had never known him. He had been a part of Maria's life, the woman Charles had abandoned in his pursuit of everything else. And yet, here he was, standing beside him, offering a chance at redemption. Charles didn't know if he deserved it, but he was determined to take it, to embrace the son he had neglected for so long. Daniel, in his quiet way, had already begun to heal the wounds of Charles's past. He had forgiven Charles in a way that Charles could barely understand, and it was that forgiveness that gave him the strength to move forward. But despite the newfound bond between father and son, the repercussions of Charles's actions were far from over. His reputation had been shattered, and the consequences of his past decisions were becoming impossible to ignore. The media had already descended, their cameras flashing as they captured every aspect of his downfall. Headlines screamed of his betrayal, his deception, and the scandal that had erupted at his wedding. His name had been tarnished beyond repair, and every business deal, every high-powered partnership he had cultivated, was now under scrutiny. For the first time in his life, Charles was no longer the man everyone looked up to. Instead, he was the man everyone whispered about in hushed tones, the man whose fall from grace had been swift and brutal. His business associates, once eager to be seen in his presence, now avoided him like the plague. They feared that his tarnished reputation would drag them down with him. Investors who had once trusted his judgment were now pulling their funds, questioning his integrity. And yet, amid the turmoil, Charles found something unexpected: freedom. For years, he had clung to his position at the top, obsessed with the idea of success, unable to let go of the world he had built. But now, as he faced the crumbling of that world, he realized just how hollow it had been. The stock market crashes and corporate takeovers no longer seemed as important. The business meetings that had once dominated his life now felt like nothing more than distractions from the real work that needed to be done. The work of rebuilding, of healing, of becoming the man his son needed him to be. Charles knew that he couldn't undo the damage he had done, but he could start anew. And that new beginning started with Daniel. They spent their days together, walking through Central Park, having long conversations about everything and nothing, sharing simple moments that Charles had never allowed himself to experience before. Daniel, eager to connect with his father, spoke about his dreams, about becoming a musician, about the books he loved to read, about the small things that made him happy. Charles listened, truly listened, for the first time in his life. He found himself learning more from Daniel than he had ever learned from the cutthroat world of finance. It was in these moments that Charles began to grasp the enormity of his mistakes. He had spent so many years chasing the wrong things: prestige, wealth, and recognition. And all the while, he had missed the one thing that truly mattered: the love of his son, the need for connection, and the chance to be a father who was present, not just in body, but in spirit. One afternoon, as they sat in the park beneath the shade of a large oak tree, Daniel turned to Charles with a question that made Charles's heart skip a beat. "Dad," Daniel asked, his voice uncertain but filled with curiosity, "do you think it's too late for me and you to be a family?" Charles felt the words catch in his throat. The simplicity of the question, the hope in Daniel's eyes, was overwhelming. Was it too late? He had been absent for so long, had neglected his son for years, had built walls that kept him from truly being there. But now, as he looked at Daniel, his son, his flesh and blood, he knew that it wasn't too late. It would never be too late. "No," Charles said softly, his voice full of emotion. "It's never too late, Daniel. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." In that moment, the weight of his past mistakes seemed to lift, if only for a moment. It wasn't an instant fix, not by any means. There would be times when the pain of his past would resurface, when the ghosts of his former life would haunt him. But as long as he had Daniel by his side, Charles knew that there was hope for redemption. The change in Charles was gradual. It wasn't as if one day he simply decided to be a different person. No, the transformation came in small, deliberate steps. He began to distance himself from the world of high finance that had once defined him. He delegated his responsibilities to trusted colleagues, slowly stepping away from the empire he had spent decades building. He sold the penthouse he had once been so proud of, trading it for a modest apartment in the heart of the city. It was a home, a place where he could start over with Daniel, where they could build their own life, free from the expectations of others. Charles also began to reach out to the people he had wronged. He contacted Maria's family, offering his support and expressing his deep remorse for the pain he had caused. He knew that no amount of money could undo the hurt he had inflicted on Maria, but he was determined to honor her memory by being there for Daniel in a way he had never been able to before. He established a scholarship fund in her name, providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children, something that would allow her legacy to live on. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Charles's life began to take shape in ways he had never imagined. He no longer sought validation from the world around him. He no longer cared about the prestige that had once been his driving force. Instead, he focused on the things that truly mattered: the love of his son, the chance to be the father Daniel needed, and the opportunity to make amends for the mistakes of his past. For the first time in years, Charles felt like he was living for something greater than himself. He was no longer just a millionaire businessman. He was a father, a man on a journey to redemption, a man who had finally found his heart. And in that, he found something more valuable than any fortune could ever provide: a sense of peace. The path forward. Charles Bond had always prided himself on being a man of action. His rise to the top of Wall Street had been a result of relentless pursuit, strategic decisions made in boardrooms, behind closed doors, or over the phone. He had never been a man to sit idly by. Every move, every calculation had been purposeful, meticulously planned to ensure that he was always a step ahead. But now, as he sat in his modest apartment, gazing out over the city he had once owned, he realized that the path forward was not going to be determined by numbers, strategies, or investment portfolios. It would be determined by the simple, honest connections he made and the willingness to rebuild the relationships he had shattered. Charles had long believed that his worth was tied to the money he made, the deals he brokered, the empire he built. In his eyes, the more successful he was, the more he could protect himself from the world that had rejected him as a child. But he had come to understand that the value of a life was not measured by the balance sheets or the luxury of one's possessions. It was measured by something far more elusive and profound: the connections he had with others, the love he could give, and the love he could receive. Daniel was the first to show him this truth. The quiet, bright-eyed boy who had burst into the cathedral with nothing but a cassette tape in his hand had unwittingly become Charles's savior. Through Daniel, Charles had learned to experience life through a lens he had spent years avoiding: the raw, unfiltered emotions of fatherhood. He had come to understand that real success wasn't about conquering markets or amassing wealth. Real success was the ability to face your own shortcomings, to ask for forgiveness, and to be vulnerable enough to allow others to help you heal. But despite his newfound understanding, Charles was acutely aware that the road ahead was not going to be easy. The media circus surrounding his wedding disaster had only intensified in the days following the public revelation of his son Daniel. The tabloids plastered his image on every cover, each headline more scandalous than the last. "The tycoon's secret son," they screamed. Wall Street King's dark past exposed. His face, once associated with power and success, was now synonymous with deceit and betrayal. His business empire, which had once been his fortress, was now falling apart. Clients pulled out, colleagues distanced themselves, and investors who had once trusted his judgment were now questioning every decision he made. His company's stock price plummeted, and the board of directors had begun to press for his resignation. They feared that his tarnished reputation would drag them down, that the scandal would cost them too much in terms of both money and credibility. And then there was Eleanor. The woman who had once been the center of Charles's carefully constructed life had disappeared completely. He hadn't heard from her since that fateful day at the altar. She had fled the cathedral in tears, unable to reconcile the image of the man she thought she loved with the person he had become in the eyes of the world. Their relationship, which had always been transactional, based on mutual benefit and status, had shattered in an instant. Charles didn't blame her for her anger. He understood her pain, and he knew that he had no right to expect her forgiveness. In many ways, Charles felt that he had lost everything. The life he had worked so hard to build had been reduced to rubble. He had been exposed as a man who had neglected his own son, a man who had lived a life of lies and deceit. But amid the wreckage, Charles knew that he had something precious now, a chance at redemption, a chance to rebuild not just his business empire, but his own character. Daniel had been his guiding light, the one thing that had kept him moving forward when everything else seemed to be falling apart. They spent their days together, their bond growing deeper with each passing moment. Charles took Daniel to school, even though it was a humble private school compared to the prestigious academies he had once thought Daniel should attend. They sat together over homework, talked about their dreams, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of life. For the first time in years, Charles was present. He was there, in the moment, truly seeing his son for who he was, not as an accessory to his own image, but as a young person with hopes, fears, and a heart that needed nurturing. And yet, Charles knew that the healing process wasn't going to be quick. There were deep wounds to mend, not just with Daniel, but with himself. For so long, he had been blinded by his own ambition. He had sought validation in power, in wealth, in the approval of others. He had never questioned why he was driven to succeed, why he had allowed his past to shape his future in such a damaging way. But now, as he sat with Daniel at the kitchen table, watching the boy sketch in his notebook, Charles began to confront the painful truth that his past decisions had been motivated by fear. Fear of inadequacy, fear of being abandoned, and most of all, fear of being vulnerable. He had built walls around himself, kept people at arm's length, because he didn't want to risk being hurt again. And yet, in doing so, he had hurt others, the ones who had mattered most. "Dad," Daniel said one evening, his voice filled with quiet wonder, "can we go fishing this weekend? I've always wanted to go, but we never had time." Charles's heart swelled at the simplicity of the request. It was a small thing, a simple activity, but it spoke volumes about the kind of relationship Daniel wanted to have with him. And for the first time in his life, Charles felt the profound weight of what it meant to be a father. It wasn't about the grand gestures, the lavish gifts, or the accolades from high society. It was about being there, truly present, for the moments that mattered most. "Of course, Daniel," Charles replied, his voice full of warmth. "We'll go fishing, just you and me." The weekend they spent at a small lake outside the city became a pivotal moment in their relationship. Charles, who had once been obsessed with power and success, found himself sitting on a boat, fishing rod in hand, listening to Daniel talk about his favorite books, his dreams of becoming a musician, and his love for drawing. For hours, they sat there, side by side, with only the sound of the water and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the silence. It was an experience Charles had never known as a child, one he had never allowed himself to experience as an adult. But now, with Daniel beside him, he was finally learning to appreciate the simple beauty of life. As the days passed, Charles became more committed to his transformation. He began to distance himself from the world of high finance that had once consumed him. He started to look for new ways to use his resources, not to fuel his own ego, but to make a positive impact on the world. He established a foundation in Maria's name, using his wealth to support single mothers and provide educational opportunities for children from underserved communities. It was an attempt to give back, to right some of the wrongs he had committed, but also to find purpose in something beyond the hollow pursuit of wealth. The transformation wasn't easy. There were days when Charles doubted himself, days when he wanted to retreat back into the comfort of his old life. But every time he looked at Daniel, every time he saw the trust in his son's eyes, he knew that he had to keep moving forward. Daniel was the future, and Charles was determined to be the father he had always needed. One evening, as they sat together in their modest apartment, Daniel turned to him with a question that had been lingering in his mind for some time. "Dad," he said, his voice hesitant, "do you think we'll ever be able to fix everything? I mean, you and me, and what happened with Mom?" Charles felt the weight of the question settle in his chest. He had never imagined that he would have the chance to mend the broken pieces of his past, to heal the wounds he had inflicted. But now, with Daniel beside him, he understood that the journey was not about fixing everything, but about starting over, one step at a time. "I don't know, Daniel," Charles said softly, "but I promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life trying. I'll make sure that you always know how much you mean to me." And with that promise, Charles Bont began the long and uncertain path toward redemption, not in the boardrooms of Wall Street, but in the quiet moments shared with his son. It was a journey that would not be easy, but it was one that he was determined to take, because in the end, it was not the empire he had built that mattered. It was the family he was finally learning to create. Rebuilding the pieces, the world outside seemed to go on, relentless and unchanged, while Charles Bont's life was in the process of being meticulously reshaped piece by piece. The echo of the scandal surrounding his public revelation as Daniel's father still resonated through the media, but slowly the frenzy started to settle. His face no longer graced the front pages as much, though his name lingered in whispers, tangled with disdain and curiosity. The foundations of his old life had crumbled into dust, but in the rubble, Charles had begun to lay the first stones of something new, something far more valuable than anything he had once sought. Daniel's presence was like a beacon that cut through the darkness of Charles's self-doubt. No longer obsessed with business deals or Wall Street's cold, calculating nature, Charles found himself unexpectedly enjoying the quiet moments, the moments when he simply existed. Just as he had taken his first steps toward understanding what it meant to be a father, he was now beginning to understand what it meant to be a man free from the relentless pressure to succeed at any cost. His life was no longer about building empires for the world to admire. It was about creating a space for love, for connection, and for healing. But even in these quieter moments, the remnants of his past would often resurface, like shadows that lingered too long, casting doubts where there should have been clarity. Charles had turned his back on the world that had once been his everything. He had sold off his massive penthouse, choosing a modest apartment in a quieter part of the city. He had stepped away from his investment firm, passing on his responsibilities to a trusted colleague, someone who could handle the operations while he tried to find a deeper purpose in life. Yet, despite his conscious efforts to escape the life he had built, the legacy of his former self had a way of creeping back in, reminding him of the mistakes he had made. The first real test came when he received a phone call from one of his former business partners, an old friend named Jonathan Meyer. Jonathan had been one of the few people who had supported Charles in the early years, when he was still a rising star in the finance world. He had been there through the long hours, the high-stakes deals, and the moments when Charles had questioned whether he could truly succeed. But now, Jonathan's voice on the other end of the line sounded different, colder. "Charles, I don't know if you remember, but we had a meeting set up a couple of weeks ago," Jonathan said. The words clipped. "I tried calling a few times. I've been hearing things. about your foundation, about your change of direction. The board's a little concerned. Charles felt his chest tighten. His past had a way of reaching out, even when he thought he had left it behind. Jonathan, I told you when I stepped down. I'm no longer involved in the business. I'm focused on other things now. Jonathan's voice wavered slightly. Yeah, well, that's the problem. Charles, you've been making some changes. The investors aren't happy. They think you're pulling out. They think you've lost your edge. A heavy silence filled the line. Charles could hear the judgment in Jonathan's tone, the unspoken disbelief that someone could simply walk away from everything they had worked for. I'm not the same person I was before, Charles said finally, his voice firm. I've made some mistakes. I know that, but I'm trying to make it right. Another long pause. I hope you know what you're doing, Charles. This isn't just some hobby. You're not playing with Monopoly money anymore. Jonathan hung up before Charles could respond, leaving him to stew in the uncomfortable realization that his attempt to rebuild, to escape the hollow pursuit of power, had consequences that were far-reaching. For the first time, the enormity of the changes he had made hit him with full force. He had let go of everything that had once defined him, but he had never fully come to terms with the emptiness that followed. The very thing that had driven him for decades, the need for success, for validation, was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But as he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city skyline that once represented his kingdom, Charles found himself remembering the simplest moments with Daniel, the moments when his son had looked up at him, wide-eyed and full of hope, and asked if they could go fishing, or if they could play a game of chess. In those moments, when Daniel's small hand grasped his, Charles had felt the weight of something far greater than any business deal, far greater than any stock market victory, the weight of being needed, being present. He had learned that the pursuit of love and connection was just as important as any corporate victory, maybe even more so. Charles's new life, one rooted in vulnerability, was not without its challenges. He had to confront the consequences of the years he had spent chasing a hollow idea of success. He had to rebuild the relationships he had abandoned and show Daniel, with actions rather than words, that he was worthy of being a father. But as much as he longed to shield his son from the harsh realities of the world, he knew that Daniel was the one who was teaching him how to truly live. Daniel was his mirror, a reflection of everything Charles had been too afraid to face about himself. And it was through this bond that Charles began to truly see the depths of his own redemption. One evening, while sitting together in the living room, Daniel turned to him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Dad, do you think people can change? I mean, really change?" The question took Charles by surprise, but he realized that it was one that had been haunting him for some time. He had often wondered the same thing. Could he really change? Could someone as damaged as he was ever truly find redemption? Could he ever repair the wounds he had caused, not only to his son but to others he had once hurt? Charles took a deep breath, his gaze softening as he met his son's eyes. "I don't know, Daniel. Change isn't easy. It's not like flipping a switch and everything's suddenly different. But I do believe that we can learn, and we can grow, and we can make things right. It takes time, and it takes a lot of hard work. But I think it's worth it." Daniel nodded, a small smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "I think so too, Dad. I think you're already doing it." The simple truth in Daniel's words struck Charles to the core. He wasn't perfect. He hadn't been the father he should have been. But he was trying. And that, for now, was enough. Despite the challenges he faced, despite the doubts that crept in and the mistakes he still needed to atone for, Charles knew that he was no longer the same man he had been. He had spent too many years chasing the wrong things. Now, for the first time, he was living for something far more valuable. His son, his family, and the love that could heal the wounds of the past. The days were not always easy, and Charles still faced moments of uncertainty, moments when the weight of his past felt too heavy to bear. But he had learned something in his journey toward redemption, that it was not about perfection, it was about progress. It was about showing up, about being present, about doing the hard work of rebuilding a life that was rooted in love, forgiveness, and understanding. And so, step by step, Charles Bont began to heal. It was a long road, one that would take him far beyond the glittering skyscrapers of Wall Street and into the quieter, more meaningful moments that had once seemed so far beyond his reach. He had learned that true success, true wealth, came not in stock portfolios, but in the moments shared with those you loved. And as he looked at Daniel, as he saw the hope shining in his son's eyes, Charles knew that he had found something far greater than any business deal, any empire, or any trophy of success. He had found the heart of redemption, and it was worth more than everything he had ever owned.